very excited to talk about real-world data for the next few minutes, and what we hope to share with you is what real-world data is, just so we have a clear definition of it, and Tom will share that for us. We hope to share with you various illustrations of how real-world data is being used in pharmaceutical companies. And then we hope to get into what are the challenges companies are facing and how are they overcoming these challenges, and also hit on what are the sources of this data, how are companies getting real-world data. The format we'll use is we'll do introductions of our panelists, then we'll ask each of them to share a perspective for about 5 minutes each, and then we have some questions for them, and then we'll take audience questions. Thanks. Okay, so we're pleased to be joined with, I'll start here at the far end, Ian Benzani. Ian is a senior principal within the Global Real World and Analytics Solutions team at IQVIA. In this role, Ian leverages his scientific background and healthcare consulting experience to help life sciences clients create and implement large-scale real-world data and technology platforms to address a variety of cross-functional needs. Tom, closest to me here, is currently the global head of real-world evidence at Astellas Pharma, where he leads the team supporting the use of real-world data to address business and research questions across all medical and development activities across Astellas. And then Kirk, in the middle, is principal owner at Lexidine, a leading patient flow simulation model consultancy for life sciences. Kirk helped pioneer agent-based patient flow simulation modeling and has built hundreds of models over the past 25 years for top pharma and biotech companies. Can we welcome our panelists, please? Thanks. Okay, Tom, can you get us started in your intro talk, by defining real-world data and making this distinction between real-world data and clinical trial evidence?
Sure. As you see above me, there's a number of different sources of real-world data. And basically, what we're looking at is any information about patients, their treatments, their outcomes, adverse experiences, et cetera, that is coming to us from sources other than clinical trials. And it's really very broad. Probably the workhorse is actually what are called administrative claims data. And every time you go to the doctor or to the pharmacy or a hospital, they want to get paid. So they have to tell the insurance company who you are, what they did, and why they did it. That information is part of a claim. It goes through a process of adjudication to make sure that it's reliable information, and then it gets paid by the insurance company. That we can track over time for every encounter for patients that are within a specific plan, with very few exceptions. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily provide a lot of rich clinical information. So, and claims get used probably about 80% of the time today. Richer clinical information is available at the individual physician practices and health systems through the electronic medical records. And nowadays, whenever you go to your doctor, they'll type in a bunch of information. Largely, it ends up in text fields. And so the challenge is, how do you structure that unstructured information and pull it forward? And so that's the second, probably largest source of information that we've got. A key disadvantage of that is the doctor's only putting in the information relevant to them. And it may not provide you with a full spectrum of what's happening with the patient, because we're getting it only from subsets of physicians, if you will, or health practices. Other sources that are up there, information about hospitals. You get a summary record, discharge abstract, largely available from those that, again, sort of at a high level tell you, but don't necessarily tell you what happened on every given day. Although there are other sources of information called Charge Master that allow you to get down line by line. On day 2, you were given 2 aspirin at a charge of $25 or whatever, because of a pricing system. And we're also starting to look more and more at some of the social media and other sources of information coming directly from patients. The challenge here is how do you sew all this information together, make sense of it, and more importantly, if you're getting different pieces, you end up with a real patchwork quilt. And what do you do about the gaps?
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Tom. Okay, we'll move to Ian now. And Ian, we'd love to have you describe some current and emerging applications of real-world data.
Next slide. Yeah. So I think there's a few themes that we're seeing, particularly with the life sciences industry, in terms of its both current and emerging uses of real-world data and real-world evidence generation. And if we take the life cycle view, I think a couple of the common themes we're seeing is one, the use of data is moving from a place of, and generating evidence from a real world perspective is moving from a place of only generating it when you're mandated, either from a regulatory or a payer perspective, to actually doing it more as an internal exercise and across a wider growing use of applications. So also doing it to facilitate internal decision making, to drive brand and franchise strategies, and also to potentially use as part of your medical and messaging programs. I think the other thing we're seeing is it's moving, the use of real-world data and real-world evidence is no longer something that is only done at around launch and post-launch from a safety perspective, but it's also moving much earlier in the development life cycle. So we're starting to see it being used in terms of early target product profile testing and simulation. We're seeing it being used a lot from clinical trial, I think, as we heard in the last panel, in terms of using data to be able to score physicians and potential trial sites, as well as be able to identify potential trial participants. And we're seeing this growing use, particularly against very competitive disease areas like hematological oncology, but also in rare diseases and niche indications when competition for these patients in terms of trials, but also being able to understand their referral pathways in trials is of growing complexity and interest. I think the other space we're seeing is actually, the growing democratization of data is the ownership of that data and the volume of that data being generated is no longer holistically owned by the life sciences industry, where traditionally we've seen that a lot of this happens in and around launch, and a lot of the evidence being generated is kind of brought by the life sciences industry to regulators and payers. Now we're actually seeing a lot of both from a regulatory perspective, as we heard, but also from a payer and provider perspective, a lot of them are making very significant investments in building their own infrastructure and leveraging their data that they sit on to be able to make decisions about your drugs and about how they optimize their own patient care, both from a clinical perspective as well as from a financial perspective. And actually, at a very interesting conference a couple weeks ago where a number of health providers in the California area were referencing the millions of dollars that they're now spending on their own infrastructure to be able to look at these drugs in a very active way, to be able to manage their own decision-making processes in terms of formulary and guidelines and treatment optimization. So I think because of that, it's a unique environment where you're seeing now this data and information is not only just being pushed in one direction, but it's a very bidirectional conversation, and therefore the importance of where that data comes from and having that context of how it should be used is critical. And then I think that the world of AI and the space of digital analytics is also creating a lot of very interesting applications in the post-launch space around treatment optimization, appropriate treatment sequencing. How do we make the best point of care decision, and what does that look like, both from a healthcare system perspective, but also from a drug class perspective. In terms of some examples, I think I've touched on one of the emerging examples that I think is of growing interest, and we're getting a lot of questions around, is the space of real-world data comparators for regulatory use, which I think is of growing interest. One, because particularly in the oncology area, either because of ethical, operational issues, or just a fast evolving treatment landscape, a lot of clients are coming to regulatory discussions with either placebo-controlled or single-arm studies, and are therefore looking at how they can best leverage real-world data to create a benchmark against their trial population, or in a very matched way can create a comparator for their trial population. And there's a growing number of examples, and I think from the FDA and the EMA perspective have actually been very progressive of saying, come with ideas that you have in this space and come and engage with us very early on so that we can create frameworks and better understand, what does good look like in this space. And I think, we've seen a number of successful examples in terms of using real-world data as part of regulatory approvals. We've also seen some label expansion opportunities and some conditional reimbursement opportunities happen both with regulators as well as with payers using real-world data cohorts. And I think, so there's a lot of promise there. I think there's also, a need to be kind of cognizant and understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And also there's a lot to be learned in terms of the quality and availability of where that data comes from a context and a bias perspective, as I think we talked a little bit about in the previous session. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Ian. And Kirk, can you speak to us a little bit about applying real-world data to address market dynamic issues?
Yeah, so hi, everybody. So one of the greatest things is that now we have this wonderful sets of data that are really super comprehensive. And there's just an amazing number of things that we can do with them. Many of these have already been talked about today. One of the things that was brought up in the prior panel is this concept that we're becoming more customized in our treatment needs. So patient demographics, region of the country, bioexpression, all of these different factors are starting to be influential in how we actually can better treat patients, how we design drug trials, where we focus our drug development efforts. And so all of this data has those components, and being able to knit together that data in sort of an integral format, we can start to understand here's where the market is today. As new therapies become available, here's how it's going to evolve based on that customization of treatment. Other things that are really exciting is just getting into regional representation. For all of us in healthcare, we know very well that things vary a lot by region for a number of factors. Payers are very influential. Treatment dynamics may be different purely based on contracting across different regions. Other diseases have very differentiated expression. We see diabetes heavier in the Southeast. We see forms of hepatitis expressing different genotypes across different parts of the country. So all of this information that's available allows us to better treat these patients and address their needs. As we start to move forward with AI and machine learning, we have, again, a great wealth of data. And one of the examples given by Julie in the prior presentation was around identifying latent patient populations. So the basic idea there is that we have some understanding of different attributes of these patients. Machine learning can be a very effective way of identifying those factors that would indicate that they may have that disease. Now, this can also be used in pulling patients forward in diagnosis and actually identifying patients that are essentially with latent disease. They don't have a full diagnosis yet, but they could actually be caught earlier in the process. So all of this data has really opened up new opportunity from sort of a data science perspective. There's so much more that we can do with the data. There's so much detail to it that it really has opened up avenues that were really never there before. One last point that I'm going to try and talk to a little bit is just the therapy evolution over time. Because we can actually have a timeline with these data sets, we're able to understand what the treatment process looks like for these patients in real life. You can see at the top there, talking a little bit about Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. So a lot of the metrics that really allow us to say, is this drug effective? So if we think of oncology, we really focus on progression-free survival and overall survival. How much does that improve? Now, one of the big mysteries is always, how does the real world compare to a clinical setting? Now, some of this data gives us the opportunity to go through and make that assessment and put these patients in a real world setting where maybe therapies aren't applied as consistently as they might be in a clinical setting, and really help us understand how is it really happening in the real world. So again, it's, there's just so much opportunity now for analytics based on this new, widely available, and incredibly large data sets.
Great. Thanks, Kirk. And Tom, you had a point to add on the last one.
Yeah, can we go to the slide with the blue chevrons across it? I want to sort of give an overview of how we're actually using these data across different, next slide, yeah, that, across the development life cycle. And the important thing to note is you got to get to those 3 green boxes at the far end. You've got to get your regulatory approval for the product, you need a value assessment, and you need to be able to tell payers how it's going to impact their budgets. But early on in the process, the real key question is how do we efficiently assess whether or not these molecules actually work? And so your proof of concepts need to be done in conjunction with the work that you're doing in the real world, because oftentimes left to their own devices, translational medicine will say, ooh, this is really cool science, and I think it's got a great application here, and then you end up with 20 patients being in the globe eligible for the treatment. And at $2 billion worth of investment, that's not a very good return on investment. So there's this interplay between looking in the clinical trial data at what you're able to demonstrate in the trial in terms of efficacy of the product, or at least get some signals for that, compared to what's happening in the real world, and understanding what's the unmet need, what's the size of the population, and who should we really be targeting. A good example there of the use of machine learning was we had a prophylactic product that we were looking at that would prevent some bad outcomes from occurring, but in the general population only occurred 1% of the time. And trying to imagine doing a proof of concept study on an event that occurs in 1 out of 100 patients. So we were able to drive that up to the point where we could actually implement it in a population where we thought we had a 1 in 20 risk of it occurring, or, sorry, a 20% risk of it occurring, 1 in 5, which dramatically changed and altered that strategy. Then as you move past the proof of concept, understanding what the current treatments are and what's the unmet need in that population becomes important for understanding what's the safety profile that's acceptable for that product. And so it really influences how you're looking at your safety assessment and the target profile. As you then move into phase 3 and you start to focus more on demonstrating the efficacy of the product, yes, the FDA will dictate some of the endpoints that you want, but if you want to make sure that you're establishing a good value proposition that payers and patients and physicians will respond to, you also need to understand in what terms they express the outcomes associated with the disease, and make sure you're capturing that information with appropriate endpoints in the clinical trials themselves, and then you can sort of build out and incorporate the evidence together to give you those 3 green boxes.
Thank you. So it's interesting for those of you who use the chain, the decision analysis steps. This is exploding the number of possibilities to bring into the information part of the chain for quality information. It's also changing the value measures that we can put new value measures on, things like patient-reported outcomes, et cetera. And it's changing the way we can frame strategy questions. So it's really impacting many parts of the decision analysis cycle. I'll share some questions with our panelists, and then please send in, and we'll try to pull questions from the audience as well. So Ian, can you just give us a quick idea of where a company's getting this data?
Gary, I think when I started in the RWE team about 10 years ago, then was IMS, it seemed like everyone was going down the approach of buying a giant box and throwing as much data in it as possible and then seeing what was happening. And the good news is we're migrating away from that strategy, because as I think a lot of people learned that it doesn't just happen, and you have to start with having really good questions. I think a lot of the strategies are getting actually very interesting as of the last few years, and I think they're starting to diverge into kind of discrete buckets. I think one area that we've seen companies take is to kind of build robust internal capabilities and platforms to harness and access this data and really concentrate on not just getting the data itself, but actually how do you develop disease area methodologies, algorithms, and applications off the back of it to help fuel an increasing number of needs and use cases across different functional areas. And I think, one example is public available is Amgen spent quite a bit of money on building each year their internal platform capabilities and continuing to expand it from a geographic perspective, broadening outside just the US, and to focus on getting deeper access and levels of data and focusing on the technology to move it from just a study-by-study capability to one that's more doing active surveillance of events and signals that they see around their populations of interest. I think one of the other strategies, which is interesting, which I think BMS has taken a really strong leadership position in, is a very external collaborative perspective. So moving away from needing to own and own the evidence flow and data itself, but actually taking a more externally facing perspective on data and evidence generation. So they set up a wide variety of research committees and networks around their immuno-oncology space, specific to very different geographies that all have very specific aims and remits and objectives that are meant to be very focused on kind of harnessing the group potential of key opinion leaders and data scientists and their own expertise to drive the science forward. And then obviously Roche, with the heavy investment they've made in the real world data and evidence generation, moving from just like leveraging the exhaust of the healthcare kind of pathway, but actually becoming partners in the delivery ecosystem, which is a very unique strategy I think we're seeing evolve in terms of buying up the Flatiron and Foundation Medicine, but also making strategic investments in the diagnostic and provider tool space so that they're actually being a part of that kind of vertical continuum of healthcare delivery.
Thanks. So I think this is fascinating and in a space that will grow. Many in the room work in portfolio management and advising these portfolio committees. So traditionally, that's been about what drugs do you have and what technology platforms. More and more, we'll see added to that, I believe, what data do you have? What data are you sharing? How are you getting access to other data? That's going to be an asset that companies are going to compete on. So let's shift to capabilities and systems. This is all going to lead to new capabilities and systems needed by companies. Can you talk about, Tom, what capabilities and systems are going to be needed?
Sure. As was previously discussed, Ian mentioned, you're getting data from a variety of different sources, and one of the key challenges is really being able to integrate that together. And as you probably are aware, in many parts of the world there are privacy regulations, so the data that we get is all de-identified. And so if you get data from source A that's de-identified and data from source B that's de-identified, how do you put the two of them together? Now, fortunately, there's some new technologies, tokenization engines, et cetera, that allow you to do that in a way that both protects the privacy of the individual patient, but also enables you ex post to integrate those patients together. So we're starting to address that. The other piece is, as you can imagine, and I alluded to earlier, if you get some information from over here and you get some information from over there, some of it overlaps. Some of these data sets are quite large. The largest claims are maybe 100 million, but there's 300 million people in the United States, so you only have 1 out of 3. If you then go get 15 million patients with EMR record, what's the likelihood that they overlap with that 100 million that you already have? Some of them will, some of them won't. And so as you start to build up what we're calling these data stacks of different kinds of information from different sources, if you restrict yourself to just analyzing those where you have all the information, which is the usual statistical approach, you run into all kinds of problems because you end up with a very narrow sliver, if any at all, depending on how many sources you're trying to connect together, and they're probably not very representative. So we're exploring the use of some of the machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms to try and sort of figure out how do we fill in those blank spaces in ways that don't contaminate our results, but allow us to use as much of the real information that we have as possible. Another key area that we're focusing on is really building out ontologies. As many of you may know, ICD-9 was about 27,000 codes. ICD-10 is about 73,000 codes just for describing diseases. There's over 200,000 NDC codes out there. If you're coding at the individual code level, it's a massive problem. So creating the appropriate ontologies and the relative hierarchies within them so that you can get at the right patients quickly and efficiently is another core capability that we need to have in place. And then layering on top of that, you need ways of quickly accessing, visualizing, and toggling the information. I mean, one of the areas that we've been exploring is the use of dashboards that really allow you, sort of like in the last session, the analytics studio to sit with your internal customer and sort of say, okay, with the current restrictions that you've got on your clinical trial, 2.74% of the patients that have the condition are able to participate in your trial. What if we flip this switch? And it becomes a question of empirically identifying what are the most important constraints, and then medically, can we justify modifying or relaxing those constraints? Think of it as a massive LP problem with linear constraints, and you're trying to move along the surface of that, and sort of how can we expand it? And it may not seem like much, but going from 2.74% to 10%, or even 5% is a big increase in the number of and availability of patients that may be the difference between having a viable trial and not having a viable trial.
Great, thanks, Tom. Kirk, can you talk a little to the challenges that these new information sources are creating for organizations and how they're addressing them?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've come across a lot is that there is sort of a loss of a translation layer. Very often there are business organizations that need support making decisions, and there tends to be a gap sort of between the data analytics. So there are often some very competent data analysis teams in-house, well-staffed, very technically competent at what they do. Now, one of the problems is that the conversation between the two groups is often missing. There's no intermediary there to really help them kind of take that data and answer business questions. So examples like, what is the opportunity going to be for this drug that you have in development? That's a very specific question that the data can answer, but if it's not posed or structured correctly within the data science group, they're going to come up with an answer that may not be answering any business questions. So one of the really big problems that we have seen is that translation layer. And one of the great ideas I thought from the last panel is this idea of sort of a studio where you bring all these people together in a room and you actually have them kind of work together. So as these approaches evolve, you have to kind of build the confidence in the approach within the business side. They also have to have a certain amount of understanding of what's going on the technical side. And then likewise, the other organization that's actually dealing with the data, they need to learn how to actually start to think about the business processes. And so it's kind of getting those two to work together is one of the biggest challenges that we've seen across the industry. Literally, some of the best data analysts, some of the best decision analysts, and some of the best strategic thinkers can all be within a company, but if they're not communicating effectively, it gets lost. And it's really sort of one of these things where it's an education process both ways. And to the degree that you can integrate those groups, which is sometimes very difficult, depending on the organization, sometimes even physically. If the data science group is located off-site, that creates tremendous challenges. So that's been one of the biggest challenges we've seen, is through the evolution on all sides of this, is getting everybody kind of on the same page and understanding the needs of the organization.
Great.
I actually have a
Go
great
ahead.
follow-up
Please.
example
Yeah.
on that of where discontinuities really sort of create a problem. So we had a phase 3 clinical trial that we were launching, and one part of the organization, epidemiology, knew that overall there's only about 17,000 patients. Another part knew that, and the clinical trial design team knew that only 3% of patients would qualify. Another team knew that there were 98 competing trials in the space. And the fourth team knew we needed 250 patients for the trial. Taken separately, none of those seem like individual challenges. However, you put all four of those dots together, and guess what? That duck ain't gonna fly.
Great, thanks. So a lot of questions coming in. It's surprising, no questions on fashion for this group, fashion tips, but we'll go with what we have.
Standard
yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Let's start with this one. This is a great question. It's about diseases that take a long time for readouts of results. So Parkinson's is the example here, and it says, what types of impact are you seeing or envisioning for real-world evidence and digital analytics on clinical trials in these types of conditions, where it takes a long time to measure results? Can real-world evidence still be relevant here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the very interesting examples, particularly that we're starting to see spring up more and more in conditions like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and even some of the new emerging kind of cell and gene therapies, where looking at durability of responses, there's some interesting novel designs coming out in terms of rollover studies or extension studies, where you're looking to try to leverage the clinical trial participants and not lose them when they move into the real world setting, so that you're getting the 3 or 4 years or maybe even 2 years on the clinical trial, and you're not losing that follow-up, but instead rolling them into a real world study where you can continue their follow-up for the next 10 to 15 years. And the other bit is around, I think from the post-marketing perspective, we're seeing a lot of interesting designs in terms of how do you leverage existing registries or support infrastructure around some of these patients, and particularly looking at rare disease registries and or some of the interesting kind of new transplant registries, and looking at how you leverage existing infrastructure out there, so you're not reinventing the wheel, and looking at how you make this minimally invasive on both the providers but also on the patients in terms of looking at follow-up.
And if I could build on that for a second, in the last session, I think they talked a little bit about IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiatives in the EU, which is a combined effort from the EU Commission, and EFPIA, which is the pharmacy industry organization in Europe. And there's a new call coming out focused around building these long-term registries associated with rare diseases. And it's looking to build off of the yesterday's or last week's announcement around the EMA for consolidating registries and sort of a pan-therapeutic or pan-European framework to really allow you to sort of look at meeting both the long-term commitments in terms of following these patients, particularly with advanced therapies, as well as being able to assess the long-term value of the treatments, particularly if they're supposedly curative, and some of those issues that feed into the discussion that was in the last session around some of the innovative contracting, and how does a organization reimburse for a cure where the cost would be potentially out over the life of the patient, or the cost savings are out over the life of the patient, but the treatment is really expensive this year.
A couple more things to add there. So one of the things is, when you look at the characterization of a disease, whether you're looking at something like Alzheimer's or prostate cancer that plays out over a long period of time, very often it's your choice of data set. So an EMR database will actually have a much more extensive record where you can kind of trace the entire process from maybe first diagnosis all the way through mortality, whereas the claims database may have a little bit more limited window, which might be good for, say, an aggressive cancer where you can actually follow the entire progression through the claims database. But it's sort of knowing your data source. And very often those EMR-type databases are very beneficial for understanding those diseases that may play out over decades.
And those are particularly strong in Europe, where you have a nationalized health system, and the patient stays with that set of providers for their entire life. So you can go back in some of those data sets back to 1970 and find information about how the patients were being treated then.
Great. This is a great question on blockchain. Is it a practical solution for getting higher quality data sets?
So I'll talk to this one. I've actually been giving it a lot of thought recently. Higher quality is sort of, that's an arbitrary question. I mean, there are some factors around what are the rules of the blockchain. One of the benefits is that it's transparent, sort of the order, the source of where the data came from. doesn't necessarily solve some of the issues of standardization that may have to occur. If you had everybody on sort of a consensus basis for all of the standardization of the data structure, you have an auditable trail of where all of this came from, you have reasonable security, it probably handles things like HIPAA right out of the box. But it's not, I mean, it's all in the implementation like anything else is my take on it.
Great. The U.S. has the richest set of available real-world evidence. What progress is being made with respect to development and access to similar data in ex-U.S. markets?
I can speak to this. I mean, I guess not sure if anyone's from Scandinavia here, but they'd probably argue against that a little bit.
Yeah, actually, I should say this person said the U.S. may have the richest
Right.
set of data.
But yeah, I think there's been actually a lot of progress through initiatives like IMI and Harmony and others around specific disease areas. I will say, increasingly in Asia, actually, there's been a lot more investment coming out from a government and from a policy perspective in terms of how governments can better leverage data. I think one example is in China where the government's invested in creating and standing up 3 big data working groups to help basically figure out and pilot how the government and how the provider systems can better leverage and bring together different data. Still very early days, but I think there's a significant amount of investment coming out, both from kind of government regulator side, but also in terms of life sciences industry, looking at making investments ex-US, where I actually think maybe some of the return on investment might actually be even larger in terms of being able to bring interesting insights to market.
And I would sort of build on that with the implementation of GDPR in Europe, at least in theory offers greater hope for greater accessibility to data. That's generalized data protection, privacy, I forget what the R is. But all of you no doubt noticed in the last 6 or 9 months, you got all these new requests from your apps to qualify. That was driven by some of the legal provisions there, and it's intended to harmonize the regulations across all of Europe, which then would help hopefully facilitate the sharing of information.
Great, thanks. Tom, people want to hear about Astellas. What were the challenges? How are you working on bringing together all this real-world information? What are the team issues? Just anything you're able and allowed to share, we want to hear about.
Well, it's actually been a really fun journey, to tell you the truth. I joined about 3 years ago when they first launched real-world informatics. And actually, I think it was, we had a very strong buy-in from top management that recognized that there were benefits associated with trying to consolidate and build out the platform. And so I think both the early launch in terms of getting a bunch of data sets, and I don't know, we've got 35 or so of them platformed from around the globe onto AWS cloud-based platforms. That actually went fairly smoothly. We do have some challenges with siloing, which I think many organizations would have. And the example I gave earlier around having different dots sitting in different people's inboxes and not necessarily connecting them, I think is a remaining challenge. And I think in general there is I would say an over-reliance on processes, and so our challenge has been to sort of get modifications put into those processes to take advantage of the new opportunities that are available. And I'm sure most of your organizations, people work very, very hard and don't necessarily have time to sort of think beyond sort of what do I have to accomplish today. And whenever you're trying to bring a disruption in to an organization, there is some pushback of, I don't have time to deal with that now, I don't have time to deal with that now. And while there is a great short-term delight in saying, look, you didn't use us, your thing blew up, we told you so, that doesn't really sort of build friendships. So managing that process, and I think also the point that you had raised about sort of facilitating that communication between the data experts and the end business users is really an important function that you can't overlook. And fortunately, I think Astellas was smart in sort of building out that layer as we were building it up.
Great, thanks. Here's a good question. It seems, and this relates to DA and uncertainty, it seems one way to integrate real-world data into the DA process is to use it to inform uncertainty assessments. What types of uncertainties can be informed by real-world evidence? Are there examples?
Maybe I'm anal, but Frank Knight sort of, I thought, had two really, in his seminal work on risk, uncertainty, and profits, I think two definitions. He defined risk as randomness with known distribution and uncertainty with randomness with unknown distribution. And I think in that context, what the real world data can help you to do is really define the probabilities associated with the risk, but may not necessarily be able to help you much with sort of the uncertainty.
Right, but okay. So it can certainly, I think, for probability of technical success, if you have, either if you have a real world aspect to your trial, or you have some endpoint that you can get data on, that you can use it to inform that uncertainty. And then, Kirk, I would think on the market size, market share, you can pull information.
So there's a few things there. One really major area of uncertainty, obviously, is the R&D process. Now, one of the things that has been done a lot more recently is actually taking a holistic market view of the R&D landscape. So basically not looking at your own assets under development, but literally every different asset under development, understanding if they're targeted to specific expressions or genotypes, looking at what the labeling will likely be like based on the clinical trial design. And what that allows you to do is, we use simulation, which is a little bit unique. And what that allows you to do is to basically play out each scenario probabilistically. So you run through, and every single asset under development goes through the development pipeline. In that specific simulation, some are going to succeed, some are going to fail. Those that succeed enter a simulated market, they play out. What you're left with is this distribution of possible outcomes given everything that we currently know. And that's a really great leverage of uncertainty. You can basically say, what are my bounds? How robust is my portfolio? What are the ranges of what I might experience? And it's really bounding that, sort of understanding what's the best that can happen, what's the worst that can happen, what are the likelihoods of all of this in the context of everything that we know. So all of this data just directly contributes to that and kind of enhances the accuracy of that distribution.
Great, thanks. Okay, lightning round, 90 seconds left. I'd like to hear one thing that you think might be surprising to the audience that's coming over the next, maybe not 10 years from now, but like 2 or 3 years from now. What's going to happen in this real world evidence space, either on the data, the tools, the competitive environment? How are things evolving?
Real quick, we're going to see a lot of genetic tests that are going to be across the board, meaning that they'll basically be like a full genome. It's going to slice patients up into these little tiny groups of risk that we've never had before, and it should dramatically improve treatment.
Couldn't agree more. The number of diagnostic startups in Silicon Valley is exploding. There's going to be tons of new data on diagnosis. Tom Marian.
I think one of the areas of interest kind of harkens back to the previous session related to just the behavioral data component. And I think one of the areas that we're seeing spring up more and more is kind of more patient-driven communities around certain disease areas and kind of taking ownership of the research and development area in terms of wanting to be part of that decision-making and research process. And so I think they factor in much more greatly in terms of this data environment. So it's not necessarily just about the healthcare system.
Agree. And these patient-reported outcomes, these foundations and patients love that idea, and they will get more and more into that data. Tom.
I think we're going to see a shift from investments within the company to really moving towards more of pre-competitive collaborations, in part driven by some of the patient advocacy groups, and in part driven by, I think, emerging regulations which are really going to give ownership rights of the data to the patient. and you'll have to sort of manage and navigate through that.
Yeah, this whole data space, and blockchain might enable it. We want to share part of our database, and this company will share part, and this foundation will share part, create a data stack that we can all benefit from. Lots of discussions there. So can we thank our panelists for a great discussion?